The Alpha Horizon. Thinking different. Acting aware.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Alpha Horizon podcast from Algebris Investments. Our industry is awash with commentary, ideas and debate about green investing and ESG. Eco or green investing is a form of socially responsible investing that focuses on businesses that support or provide products and practices that are environmentally friendly. And the main objective of these companies is to develop new technologies that support the transition from carbon dependence to more sustainable alternatives. Now, it's very important to approach green investing in the context of the wider investment environment. There are, of course, other market drivers, such as inflation, for instance, and this will be the focus for this podcast. Regular listeners and Algebris followers will be aware of our Silver Bullet commentary, and we have recently added an additional insights commentary called The Green Leaf. The first edition of this was published in October, and today we'll talk through what was covered in this note. My name is Douglas Branson, and I'm Head of Business Development at Algebris. I'm very pleased to be joined by Silvia Merler, who is Head of ESG and Policy Research, and Gabriele Foà, who is a Portfolio Manager on our Global Credit team. Hi Silvia. Hi Gabriele.
Thank you, Doug.
Hi, Doug.
Okay, so I'd like to start with a question to you, Silvia. What is the biocapacity deficit and why does it matter so much?
Well, the biocapacity deficit is a concept that basically measures the difference between how much natural resources we demand from our planet in a given year. In 2021, for example, humans will require almost 2 planets' worth of ecological resources to meet our demand for the year. The last year when we have consumed only what Earth could regenerate was 1970. Ever since then, we have been running a massive biocapacity deficit. The reason why this is important is that not only this gives us a measure of how much we are over-consuming in terms of natural resources, but also this is a cost that has never really been priced so far, but that very soon we will have to price. So there's a question of understanding what will climate inflation look like at that point.
Understood, Silvia. Thank you. And moving to you, Gabriele, why is this significant cost not absorbed by consumers?
When consumers or firms take part in polluting activities, they do produce a social cost but don't pay any price for it. As such, they feel entitled to produce a lot of this activity, and there's no price mechanism that puts a cap. This is different from other markets where consumers consume only as much of a given good because they pay the price for it. So any polluting activity, including CO2 emissions, is an externality, as consumers of the emission get the benefit of pollution but don't bear the cost. Until recently, emissions have not been taxed, and polluting activities did not suffer any restrictions. Moreover, social pressure on polluting corporates and net zero policies are only a recent phenomenon. As such, this big cost for the planet has not been internalized by economic actors so far.
Great, thanks, Gabriele. And following on from that, another question to you, Silvia. If this cost was absorbed by consumers, what would be its impact on inflation and how would it manifest itself? In other words, how would it become apparent?
Well, it's not easy to estimate precisely what the cost would be of internalizing such externality, as Gabriele was saying, but one way that we can approach this question is by asking ourselves how prices would have behaved, how different prices would have been had the CPI included the cost of paying for the good that we were over-consuming, so for our growing CO2 emissions. This is what we try to do in our paper, and we find that the price level today would be roughly 50% higher than it is currently estimated to be. So if consumers were to be made to pay for the growing emissions, the cost would be roughly equivalent on average to 1% of per capita EU household consumption expenditure per year. So it's an effect of 1% on prices every year, which is really significant. In terms of what can drive this internalization, I think policy really is the main factor playing a role here, because as all national authorities and the European Union are pushing for very ambitious net zero targets, the cost of energy, the cost of polluting, and the cost of CO2 emissions will remain elevated and will very likely increase over the next few years.
Thanks, Silvia. And lastly, Gabriele, just for you, Algebris has obviously done a huge amount of work to understand the dynamics here. how do the results of this work fit within the context of the current inflation environment?
Inflation is finally back on investor radars, but it has not been an issue for a very long time. In the past 10 years, central banks have struggled to reach 2% inflation targets. Our results suggest that the contribution of emissions to inflation could be in the order of 1%. Then, allowing central banks to include emission in the CPI basket basically would have done half of the job for the major central banks. Moreover, the contribution of emission is also large relatively to another important component of inflation, which is energy. Energy inflation in Europe has averaged 0.75% over the past 20 years, while, as we explained before, emission inflation would be in the order of 1%. Then, if it had been internalized, emission inflation would have trumped also energy inflation. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that once inflation normalizes from the currently high level, the current anomalies basically due to energy supply restrictions and COVID, the impact of energy emission inflation on core inflation could be pretty important. And this probably will have a permanent and important impact on central banks' behavior and interest rate markets more in general. In other words, historically, we have been used to think that inflation is purely a monetary phenomenon, but the green transition means that going forward, it may turn into a physical phenomenon too.
So that leaves me to thank Silvia and Gabriele for their time, and always to thank our listeners.
Thank you, Doug, and always great to be on this podcast with you.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for having us, and great to join you.
As mentioned at the start of the podcast, we are excited to have published the first edition of the Greenleaf Commentary, and we look forward to covering further editions in future podcasts. So until next time.
The Alpha Horizon. Thinking different. Acting aware.